When Amy realizes that her perfect man is not her salvation but a threat, she is left with only one choice. Run before it's too late. But will she be able to escape? Before you start watching, leave a like if this story touches your heart, and subscribe so you don't miss more heartfelt stories. Amy sits in a cozy cafe by the window, lazily stirring her cooling coffee with a spoon. The aroma of the drink wraps around her like a delicate mist, blending with the scents of fresh pastries and the rain tapping against the glass. Outside, the world seems gray, but inside her, there is sunshine, warmth, and joy. She smiles, looking at the phone screen where a new message appears. He has written, "Good morning, my beautiful. Have you already missed me?" Her heart flutters like a butterfly caught in the web of emotions. Her fingers dance over the screen, hurriedly typing a reply. "A lot. When will we see each other?" The message is read instantly. The reply comes almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for her words. "Tonight, I have a surprise for you." Amy bites her lip, trying to contain her excitement, but anticipation spreads through her body like melted chocolate. It has been 3 months already. 3 months of absolute happiness, filled with attention, passion, and promises. Josh was perfect. Too perfect. Do men like this still exist? She would exclaim with delight to her friends when they warned her to be careful. But she laughed in response because he was her dream, her fairy tale. He knew how to make her feel special. Bouquets of fresh roses in the morning, spontaneous trips out of town, tender whispers under the night sky filled with vows and passion. Everything felt like it had come straight out of a romantic movie, where every frame was perfection. But that evening something changes. "Hey baby." Josh kisses her temple. His lips are colder than usual, but Amy doesn't pay attention to it. He seats her at the table in his home, where the soft glow of candles dances on the walls, filling the room with a cozy atmosphere. "You're incredible." Amy smiles, feeling like the happiest woman in the world. She looks at him with tenderness but suddenly notices that his gaze has changed, intense, slightly distant, filled with something subtly unsettling. "Amy, do you love me?" She laughs, feeling her heart still dancing to the rhythm of their flawless romance. She takes his hand, feeling its familiar warmth. That's a silly question. But he doesn't smile. The corners of his lips are tense. "You know I don't tolerate betrayal." Her smile falters slightly, but she quickly dismisses the creeping sense of unease. "Of course. What are you talking about?" Josh hesitates as if weighing every word, then shrugs, but there is more tension than ease in his gesture. "I just want to be sure. You are mine. Only mine." He squeezes her hand slightly tighter than usual, just enough for her to feel an icy shiver run down her spine. There is something cold, unfamiliar in his voice, but he quickly slips back into his mask of tenderness, and Amy convinces herself she imagined it. She pushes away the anxious thought. Love is always a little scary, isn't it? Several days had passed, but the strange feeling wouldn't leave Amy. She tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that her fears were unfounded, that it was just a result of her excessive sensitivity. But inside, the tension was growing, like a tightened string ready to snap at any second. Josh's words, "You're mine, only mine," echoed in her mind, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading, but never disappearing completely. They sit in a restaurant where soft, relaxing music plays, and the dim lighting creates an atmosphere of coziness and intimacy. Through the large panoramic windows, the night city sparkles, vibrant, full of energy. But Amy can't enjoy the moment. Her thoughts scatter in all directions, overwhelmed with anxiety. The candles on their table cast soft reflections on the pristine white tablecloth, but even this familiar comfort feels foreign to her. Josh smiles, his face remaining flawlessly handsome, but there's something new in his eyes, something heavy, piercing. He looks at her as if trying to peer into her soul, searching for something only he knows. "You seem thoughtful tonight." His voice is gentle, but there's a note of wariness in it. He reaches for her hand and squeezes her wrist slightly tighter than usual. There's no pain in his touch, but there's something persistent, desperate, that makes Amy tense up. "What are you thinking about?" Amy flinches at his sudden directness. She takes a deep breath, trying to sort out her feelings. She needs to speak, to express her doubts, but something inside her holds her back, as if warning her that the truth could change everything. "About us," she finally says, trying to keep her voice steady. "About the way you feel about me." Josh leans in slightly, his eyes carefully studying her face as if trying to read something important. His voice lowers, but there's an untraceable firmness in it that makes her heart beat faster. "Haven't I given you everything you ever wanted? Haven't I proven my love?" Amy nervously licks her dry lips. She knows she must choose her words carefully, to not anger him, to avoid creating even more tension between them. "Yes, but..." She hesitates, her voice softer than she intended. "Sometimes you speak as if you're afraid of losing me." His fingers tighten around her hand, and now it's no longer just an affectionate gesture. It's something more. Warm, yet terrifying pressure that makes it hard to breathe. "Because I am afraid." His eyes flash, filled with something wild, primal, beyond explanation. "I don't want anyone to take you away from me. You understand that, don't you?" Amy nods, but inside everything turns upside down. Fear creeps into her mind with sticky, cold fingers. She wants to say something else, but at that moment, the waiter brings their order, and Josh changes instantly. His face lights up with a friendly smile. He thanks the waiter in a warm, velvety voice that sends chills down Amy's spine. How does he switch so fast? How can he be both loving and terrifying? She watches him, catching every detail. The elegant way he picks up his fork, the way his lips curl into a charming smile, the way he laughs at some harmless comment from the waiter. But now she can't deceive herself anymore. There's something dark in him, something hiding beneath the mask of a perfect man. Amy increasingly felt trapped in a gilded cage. The love that once seemed so real now felt like shackles, leaving her not a single drop of freedom. She tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination, that Josh cared for her, but the little details betrayed the truth. He knew everything. Or at least that's how it seemed to her. He knew when she left the house, when she returned, whom she met. His questions, which once seemed caring, now sounded like an interrogation. "Were you at the store for a long time?" He would ask when she came home. "The line was long," she answered, trying not to show her tension. He nodded, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. He said nothing, but she could feel he didn't believe her. One day, she saw his car parked near her office. He wasn't supposed to be there. But when she stepped outside, he smiled at her as if nothing had happened. "A coincidence," he explained. "I just decided to pick you up." She smiled back, but something inside her trembled. This wasn't a coincidence. More and more, she checked her phone before coming home, deleting messages that might raise questions. Her fear had become an invisible companion. She was no longer free. But when exactly had she lost her freedom? She didn't know. In the past few weeks, Amy's anxiety had turned into a constant feeling of suffocation. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when her life ceased to be her own, but now every move felt calculated, every step measured. She lived holding her breath, trying not to do anything that might raise Josh's suspicion. He knew everything, or at least that's how it seemed to her. He knew when she left the house, when she returned, whom she saw. Her phone, once a means of communication, now felt like a chain binding her to him. Sometimes she sensed that he was checking her calls, reading her messages. She caught his gaze as he watched her dial a friend's number, his fingers twitching as if he was waiting for something he couldn't quite explain. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that she was overthinking, but her intuition whispered otherwise. The inner voice she had ignored for so long was now screaming at full force, forcing her to realize she was trapped. "You've been distant," he said one evening at dinner, slowly stirring his soup. His voice was even, but there was a hidden threat beneath it. "What are you thinking about?" Amy looked up at him, her hands clenched into fists under the table, nails digging into her skin, leaving painful imprints. She wanted to tell the truth. She wanted to admit that she was afraid of him, but the words got stuck in her throat, as if strangled by an invisible hand of fear. "Work," she replied, forcing a smile, but her lips trembled. "Just tired." He nodded, but she could see that his eyes remained cold, watchful. He studied her face, his gaze piercing through her. She knew he didn't believe her. That night was the last time she slept peacefully. She lay still for a long time, feeling her thoughts spiral in her mind. Josh wouldn't leave her consciousness. His stare, his cold manner of speaking, his sudden questions. She heard him walking around the house before bed. But something was different. His steps were slower, more deliberate. Each footstep echoed like an approaching danger. She closed her eyes but couldn't make herself sleep. The inner voice kept repeating the same thing. "You need to leave." Then a sudden noise outside. She flinched but realized it was just a car passing on the street. Her heart pounded so fast she feared he might hear it. The room was filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by her ragged breathing. But just as she finally allowed herself to believe he wouldn't come, the bedroom door slowly creaked open, making her shudder. In the dim light of the hallway, Josh appeared. His shadow stretched across the floor like a sinister omen of what was to come. There was no tenderness in his eyes, only a dark, bottomless void. "Amy." His voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "We need to talk." She froze, her heart pounding in a frantic rhythm, blood turning to ice in her veins. A chill ran down her spine, paralyzing every muscle. It felt as if her body refused to obey her. "About what?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended, and it betrayed a slight tremble. Josh closed the door behind him, muting the occasional sounds from the street. Now they were alone, just him and her. Amy felt the space around her grow smaller, the walls of the bedroom seeming to close in, trapping her in a corner. "I feel like something has changed," he said in a steady, almost thoughtful voice, his gaze drifting over her face, searching for an answer. "You're acting differently. Distant. Cold. I don't like it when you pull away." She swallowed hard, struggling to maintain her composure. Her fingers curled into a fist under the blanket, nails digging into her palm, causing pain. Anything to keep from showing weakness. "I'm just tired from work," she said, forcing a smile, though her lips barely obeyed. "Nothing has changed." Josh tilted his head, watching her with an almost childlike curiosity. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, like someone who was fully in control. Amy felt a lump rise in her throat. Her body tensed instinctively, as if bracing for an impending storm. "You know you can trust me, right?" His voice softened, almost tender, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. There was a hidden threat within it, sharp as a blade. "I just want to know that we're okay. You wouldn't want any secrets between us, would you?" She nodded, though deep inside, she felt the fragile line separating her from the abyss growing thinner. His words sounded like a warning, a reminder of who was in control here. Cold sweat formed on her back, but she fought to keep her expression unreadable. "Of course," she whispered, trying to keep her voice from betraying the panic. "We're fine." But she knew he didn't believe her. Amy didn't remember how long the conversation lasted. Maybe a couple of minutes. Maybe an eternity. Josh was still standing in front of her, studying her face, trying to extract even the smallest fragment of a lie. His breathing was steady, calm, but within that silence lay a threat that sent an icy chill down her spine. She felt her fingers trembling as they clenched the thin fabric of the blanket. Did she want this? Of course not. But fear told her that any mistake could cost her too much. "Why are you so tense?" he asked, taking another step forward. His voice was soft, but within that calmness lurked something dangerous, something that made her heart tighten with panic. "I'm not tense," she exhaled, feeling her voice betray her with a slight tremor. Just tired." "Tired?" Josh nodded slowly, but his eyes darkened. "Of what, Amy?" "Of me?" Amy instinctively pulled back, her spine pressing against the headboard of the bed, as if it could offer her some form of protection. At that moment, she realized she could no longer keep pretending, but telling the truth was far too dangerous. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. She felt how her chest struggled to rise and fall under the weight of her own fear. A lie slipped through her lips, but she already knew. He wouldn't believe it. Josh sat at the edge of the bed, his fingers lazily gliding over the sheets, as if he were the master of this space, as if he were studying her the way one studies an object that belongs to them alone. His movements were relaxed, but within that relaxation lurked a threat. "You do understand that I just want to know that you're happy, right?" His voice was soft, almost tender, but she heard the steel woven into his tone. "I try so hard, Amy. I do everything for you. I know." Her voice came out barely audible. "Then why do you avoid me? Why do you act like you want to pull away?" His fingers curled into a fist. "You don't think I would do something bad to you, do you?" She swallowed, feeling cold sweat gather on her back. Those words sounded so familiar. He always said them before he started checking her phone, before he appeared in places she hadn't expected him, before she felt like she was losing herself. How many times had he convinced her that all of this was care, that it was an act of love? And how many times had she tried to convince herself? I need a little space," she mumbled, lowering her gaze so he wouldn't see the fear in her eyes. "Sometimes I just want to be alone." "Alone?" Josh smirked, but there was no warmth in it. "Am I not enough for you?" Josh leaned in closer, his warm breath brushing against her cheek. The scent of his cologne, which she had once found pleasant, now made her want to recoil. But she couldn't. She knew that any movement, any gesture could be taken as a sign of distancing, and he wouldn't tolerate that. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he ran his fingers over her wrist, and at that touch, Amy wanted to pull away, but she forced herself to remain still. Her heart was beating so fast that she feared it would give away her fear. She felt the tension in her muscles, the tremor running down her spine. "Then tell me the truth," he whispered, his voice growing even softer, even gentler, but that only made it more terrifying. "You wouldn't want to lie to me, would you?" "Of course not." Amy tried to smile, but her lips barely obeyed. "That's good." He slowly ran his fingers along her cheek. "Because I won't tolerate lies." She felt her lungs tighten, making it difficult to breathe. An inner voice was screaming at her to run, to break free before it was too late. But how? Where? Josh was everywhere, controlling everything. Her heart pounded so hard she feared he could hear its roar. She was standing on the edge. One wrong word and everything could collapse. She had to choose her next move. And this time there was almost no choice left. Amy lay motionless, feeling how her body had literally frozen with fear. In the darkness of the room, she could make out only the silhouette of Josh sitting at the edge of the bed. His breathing was steady, but within that calmness lurked a threat that made her legs weak. It seemed to her that even the air in the room had grown heavier, filled with tension that made her chest tighten with every breath. "I want to believe that you're being honest with me," he repeated, his fingers lightly touching her hand. The touch made her shudder, and an unpleasant chill ran down her spine. Amy felt panic rising inside her, washing over her in waves. She knew that if she faltered, if she revealed even a hint of fear, he would notice. And that would mean the end. She didn't know how much longer she could live like this. She didn't know how much time she had left before this illusion of safety burst. "Of course," she whispered, barely breathing. "I am honest." Josh studied her closely, his gaze seeming to penetrate the depths of her soul, searching for the truth hidden within. Her breathing became shallow, controlled, so as not to betray the tremor in her voice, to not give him a single reason to doubt her words. She felt his eyes scanning every feature of her face, as if he could read her thoughts, dismantling all her emotions piece by piece. But he said nothing. He only nodded slowly and stood up. "Good. Then sleep, Amy. We both need rest." His voice was even, but there was a strange note in it that sent a shiver through her body. His words sounded almost caring, but Amy knew that behind them lay something far more sinister. She heard his footsteps heading toward the door, then a pause, as if he hesitated. She held her breath. Then the door closed softly, but there was no familiar click of the lock. He hadn't locked her in, for the first time in a long while. First, she didn't believe it. Maybe he had just forgotten. Maybe he was testing her, waiting to see what she would do. Was this a trap? Or was it truly a chance? Her heart pounded violently. Slowly, so as not to disturb the air, she sat up in bed. Every movement felt strained, as fear locked her muscles, making them unresponsive. Her hands trembled as she reached under the pillow for her phone, but when she looked at the screen, she realized it was useless. The battery was dead. As if fate itself was telling her that she could only rely on herself. There was only one way out. She stood up, her legs weak, but she forced herself to take a step. One, then another. The floor beneath her feet seemed to creak treacherously, but it was only the noise of her own mind. Her breathing was ragged. She reached the door and listened. Silence. A silence so deep it rang in her ears. Cautiously, she pressed the handle and cracked the door open. The cold air of the hallway hit her face, momentarily bringing her back to reality. Her eyes darted left, then right. Where was he? In the bedroom? In the kitchen? Or standing in the dark, waiting? Her heart pounded so loudly that it felt like even the walls could hear it. Her chance was here and now, and she had to take it. Amy took a deep breath, listening to every sound. The hallway seemed endlessly long, and every step she took could be a fatal mistake. She felt the tension pulsing in her veins, each movement coming with difficulty. Her legs felt like they were filled with lead, but fear gave her strength. She carefully stepped over the threshold, pressing her palm against the wall to keep her balance. The floor beneath her bare feet was ice cold. One thought spun in her mind: don't make a sound. Josh's bedroom door was slightly open. Amy froze, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She didn't know if he was asleep. Her fingers clutched the doorframe, nails digging into the wood to keep herself from shaking. Silence. She took another step. Suddenly, a faint sound in the darkness. A soft rustling of fabric, barely perceptible. Amy froze, not breathing. Inside, everything tightened into a knot. Was it him? Or was her imagination playing a cruel trick on her? Seconds stretched into eternity. She wanted to run but knew, one wrong step, and everything would be over. She took another step, then another, moving toward the front door. Just a few meters. Just a few meters to freedom. But then his voice cut through the air, quiet but distinct. Where are you going, Amy? Amy froze, her breath catching, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like the whole world could hear it. Where are you going? Those words rang like a sentence. She knew. If she turned around, if she made even one wrong move, it would be over. I need some water, she whispered, barely managing to control the tremor in her voice. Silence. Then a sound, the soft rustling of fabric, a muffled step. He was up. He was coming closer. You know I don't like it when you wander around at night. Josh's voice was quiet, but there was an unmistakable threat in it. You don't think I don't trust you, do you? She clenched her fingers into fists, struggling to suppress her panic. Retreating was not an option. This was her only chance. I'm sorry, I just couldn't sleep, she said a little louder, taking a step back. Just get there. Just make it in time. But before her fingers could touch the door handle, he caught her wrist. Where do you think you're going? There was no more tenderness in his voice, only steel-like certainty. Amy gasped, her eyes darting toward the door. Freedom was so close. But maybe she was wrong. Maybe there was no way out. Amy felt his grip on her wrist loosen, but not completely disappear. It was a test. He was waiting for her reaction, searching for any signs of deception, and if she made even one wrong move, he would tighten his fingers like a trap. Her thoughts raced. What to do? She could keep reassuring him, convincing him she wasn't going anywhere. Or, her body acted faster than her mind. A sudden yank. She twisted her wrist free from his grasp and stumbled backward. Her heart pounded like a gunshot, and in that instant her legs propelled her forward. Amy! Josh's voice shattered the silence. There was no gentleness left, only anger and panic. She lunged for the door, her hands trembling as she grabbed the handle. Please, please, just in time. But before she could turn it, footsteps pounded behind her. He was faster. A yank, his hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her toward him. Darkness raged in Josh's eyes. You're not leaving, he hissed, his fingers tightening. Never. Amy fought, twisted, her nails digging into his arm, but he was stronger. Her back hit the wall, knocking the breath from her lungs. "No, no, not like this. Josh, please." Her voice broke into a whisper. But she saw it. There was no mercy in his eyes. Only the fear of losing her, twisted into fury. She knew. If she didn't escape now, she never would. Amy felt his grip on her wrist loosen, but it didn't disappear completely. This was a test. He was waiting for her reaction, searching for the smallest signs of deception, and if she made even one wrong move, he would tighten his fingers like a trap. Her thoughts raced. What should she do? She could keep reassuring him, convincing him she wasn't going anywhere. Or, her body moved faster than her mind. A sudden yank. She twisted her wrist free from his grasp and stumbled backward. Her heart pounded like a gunshot, and in the next instant, her legs propelled her forward. "Amy!" Josh's voice shattered the silence. There was no softness left, only anger and panic. She sprinted toward the door, her hands trembling as she grabbed the doorknob. Please, please, just in time. But before she could turn it, footsteps pounded behind her. He was faster. A sharp yank, his hand gripped her shoulder, spinning her toward him. Darkness raged in Josh's eyes. "You're not leaving," he hissed, his fingers tightening. "Never." Amy fought, twisted, her nails digging into his arm, but he was stronger. Her back slammed against the wall, knocking the breath from her lungs. "No, no, not like this. Josh, please." Her voice broke into a whisper. But she saw it. There was no mercy in his eyes. Only the fear of losing her, twisted into fury. She knew. If she didn't escape now, she never would. Everything happened within seconds. Amy felt the walls of the room closing in around her, the air thickening, every breath coming with difficulty. Josh held her tight, his fingers digging into her shoulders as if she belonged to him. But she wasn't going to give up. She knew she had only one chance. One. Gathering all her strength, Amy lifted her knee and slammed it into his shin. Josh hissed, stumbling back, and that brief moment was enough. She tore free from his grasp and without hesitation, bolted for the door. "Amy!" His voice broke into a guttural growl, but she wasn't listening anymore. She grabbed the handle, wrenched the door open and sprinted into the hallway, her feet slipping on the wooden floor. But fear pushed her forward. "Run. Just run." Behind her, the sound of heavy footsteps. Josh had recovered. He was chasing her. Her heart pounded wildly, blood roaring in her ears. The stairs. She leaped down 2 steps at a time. The door. The lock. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the key. "Don't do this, Amy." His voice was close, too close. "Faster, faster." Click. The door burst open, and the cold night air hit her face. Amy bolted into the darkness, her legs carrying her away. Away from that house, away from him. But the fear remained. It always remained. Was she truly free now? The cold night air struck Amy's face, burning her lungs. She ran, never looking back, her bare feet skidding on the wet asphalt, but she didn't feel the pain. Only fear propelled her forward. The streets were deserted, the city asleep. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, echoing her own silent scream. Her heart pounded so loudly it felt like she could hear it outside her body, reverberating in the stillness around her. "Run, run, just keep going." Amy turned the corner, her breath ragged, her legs heavy as lead. She knew Josh wouldn't give up so easily. He wasn't used to losing. He would search for her. And he would find her unless she found a way to disappear. She darted into the first alley she saw, hiding behind trash containers, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle her sobs. Her chest burned, tears blurred her vision. What now? Where could she go? Suddenly, footsteps behind her. Slow. Heavy. Amy held her breath. "Amy!" The voice she feared most whispered her name into the night. He was here. Amy froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't believe he was already here. How had he found her? Her palms were slick with sweat, her fingers digging into the cold, filthy edge of the container. She remained motionless, but she knew, if she stayed here, he would find her. She had to move. Now. "Amy." His voice was closer than it had been a second ago. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on its trapped prey. "Baby, let's not play games. You know you can't run from me." A suffocating fear gripped her, but she forced herself to think. What could she do? She had no phone, no weapon. Only one chance. She took a deep breath, then suddenly turned and ran, bolting from behind the containers. "Just make it, Amy." His voice exploded through the night, and she heard rapid footsteps closing in behind her. He was close, too close, but she couldn't stop. Amy ran forward, not feeling her legs, not thinking about tripping or falling. There was only one thought in her head: run before he catches her again. She could hear his footsteps behind her. Heavy, fast, determined. He wasn't giving up. She turned the corner, her breath ragged, her chest burning from lack of air. For a second she thought the street ahead was empty, that she had a chance. But then a familiar voice rang out. "Amy, stop. You don't understand what you're doing." She didn't stop. She couldn't. She knew that if she turned around, if she slowed down, it would be over. Josh was always faster, always stronger. Dim lights from a 24-hour store appeared ahead. People. There were people inside. With the last of her strength, Amy lunged forward, nearly falling, and burst inside. The bright light blinded her. The smell of coffee and cheap pastries hit her nose. The cashier, a man in his 50s, looked up from the register, staring at her in surprise. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, seeing her terrified face and heaving breaths. Amy opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. She could feel that Josh was close. What if he came in? What if no one believed her? She had to say something, now, or this would be her end. Amy gasped for air, her chest rising and falling in a frantic rhythm. Her legs were shaking, but she couldn't afford to lose her grip on reality. This moment was all she had left. She turned to the cashier, her lips parted, but fear tightened around her throat. "Please." Her voice was barely audible, almost foreign. "Help me." The man behind the register frowned, glancing at the glass door, where Josh's silhouette loomed. The dim light obscured his face, but Amy knew. He was staring right at her. "Miss, are you feeling okay? Do you need help?" The cashier slowly stepped out from behind the counter. She stepped back. Her fingers clutched the edge of the counter as if it were her last hope.
"No."
"No, he." Amy tried to say more, but her body wouldn't obey. She saw the door crack open, the cold air rushing in along with his presence. A choice. Run again, hoping this man would help her, or, "Baby, calm down." Josh's voice was low, soft, but beneath that gentleness was something icy. "You're scaring me." Amy felt the world narrow, leaving only a tunnel in front of her eyes. If she made the wrong move, there would be no second chance. Amy felt her heart tighten, lodged somewhere in her throat, making it hard to breathe. The entire world shrank to the few feet between her, the cashier and Josh, who now stood halfway inside the store. His eyes searched for her, dark with quiet determination. The cashier took another cautious step forward, frowning. "Do you really need help, miss?" His voice carried hesitation but also concern. Amy swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Yes," her voice was weak but steady. "I need you to call the police." Silence. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped. "Amy." Josh's voice was smooth, coaxing. "Why the drama? Let's just talk." She didn't answer. She couldn't anymore. She had already made her choice. The cashier reached for the phone. Josh tensed. Amy watched as the cashier reached for the phone. At that moment Josh took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. His face remained calm, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "Don't," he said slowly, staring at the cashier. "Amy's just tired. She's had a rough day." The cashier glanced from Josh to her. Amy felt everything inside her tighten. She knew, if she stayed silent now, it would all be over. "Please," she whispered. "Call them." The cashier hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. He was uncertain. Josh took another step, his voice softening, but that only made it more terrifying. "Amy, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Let's just go home." She could feel the tension filling the space between them. One wrong move and everything would collapse. Then a sound broke through the air. Loud, jarring, almost unreal. The phone rang. The cashier had called the police. Josh froze. The phone rang, shattering the silence like a bolt of thunder. Amy felt her heart clench, her breath catching. The cashier, holding the receiver to his ear, nodded, confirming that the call had gone through. Josh froze, his fingers tightening in a tense grip. His eyes darkened, his face remained still, but the tension in his body spoke louder than words. He slowly turned to Amy, his gaze turning icy. "Do you really want it to end like this?" His voice was calm, but there was a hidden fury within it. Amy didn't respond. She knew this was his last attempt to break her. Outside, the wail of sirens echoed, loud, piercing, promising salvation. Josh took a step back, as if weighing his options. The cashier watched him with tension, the phone still clutched in his hand. "You should leave," he said firmly. But Josh didn't move. He stared straight into Amy's eyes. One last time. The door burst open and police officers stormed into the store. Josh sank to his knees, clasping his hands behind his head. The officers rushed toward him, grabbing his arms, forcing him to the floor. The sound of handcuffs clicked, cold metal snapping around his wrists. He didn't resist. Amy stood to the side, her body trembling. She could hear Josh's heavy breathing, the officers shouting commands, but it all felt distant, muted. The world around her seemed to slow down, voices becoming blurry. Only one thought repeated in her head. "This is the end. Are you all right, miss?" One of the officers approached her, his voice cautious but firm. She opened her mouth to answer but could only nod. Her throat was dry, her breath unsteady. She knew that if she spoke, all the pain, all the horror of the past months would come pouring out. Josh suddenly lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were no longer cold, no longer terrifying. There was something else, emptiness? Regret? Or could he simply not believe that she was truly gone? "Amy." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Her heart stopped for a moment. But she didn't respond. Not now. Not after everything. The officers led him out of the store. She watched him go until the doors slammed shut, cutting them apart. He was gone. He could no longer control her. So why did she still feel so empty inside? A week had passed. Amy sat by the window, watching the wind sway the trees outside. The soft hum of the street felt unfamiliar. Life continued moving forward, even though her inner world was shattered. She traced the edge of her teacup with her fingers, feeling the warmth but not really registering it. Her body was here, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the days when she had still lived in fear. Josh could no longer reach her. He was behind bars. And yet, his voice still echoed in her mind. "Do you really want it to end like this?" He had asked in the store. And she answered herself again and again. Yes, she did. It had to be this way. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. A life without him awaited her. And for the first time in a long while, that thought didn't scare her. It gave her hope. Love should never be a cage. True feelings are built on freedom, trust, and respect, not on control and fear. Sometimes the hardest but most necessary step is escaping a relationship where you are being oppressed. Freedom and safety matter more than the illusion of love. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.